Something is changing in global politics, and most people have not fully realized the scale of it yet. For decades, one alliance in Washington seemed almost untouchable. A relationship that survived election after election, administration after administration, and countless moments of international controversy. But now, for the first time in generations, that foundation is showing visible cracks. And the surprising part is this: the pressure is not only coming from foreign governments or international organizations, it is coming from inside the very groups that once formed the strongest base of support. The political landscape around Israel, America's role in the Middle East, and the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is shifting. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. And when you start looking at the numbers, the elections, and the changing attitudes across generations, a much bigger story begins to appear. A few weeks ago, something happened in one of America's most politically influential cities. In Manhattan, a place often viewed as one of the strongest centers of support for traditional pro-Israel politics, candidates who openly questioned unconditional American backing for Israel performed far better than many expected. These were not isolated results. They reflected a much wider trend. For years, public opinion has been changing, especially among younger Americans. Many voters who once saw support for Israel as a simple, unquestionable part of American foreign policy are now asking harder questions. What should America's role be? How far should support go? And what happens when an ally's actions create a growing divide between government policy and public opinion? Perhaps the most significant shift is happening among a group that has historically been one of Israel's strongest supporters in the United States: evangelical Christians. For decades, many evangelical communities viewed support for Israel as both a political and religious commitment. But younger generations within those communities are increasingly looking at the conflict through a different lens. They are seeing the same images the rest of the world sees: cities destroyed, families displaced, civilian suffering broadcast instantly across social media. And for many, those images have created a difficult question. How does this align with the values they were taught? Political alliances are often built on decades of loyalty, but they rarely survive when the beliefs holding them together begin to change. And this shift is not only happening in America. Across the world, attitudes toward Israel have changed dramatically. Countries that once remained neutral or quietly supportive have become far more critical. The reason is simple. For the first time in history, nearly everyone has a front row seat. A conflict that once played out through official statements and newspaper headlines is now unfolding directly on billions of screens. People are witnessing the consequences in real time, and that has made it much harder for governments and institutions to maintain the same level of support without facing public pressure. But to understand why this moment matters, you have to go back much further than the current war. Because this debate did not begin recently, it goes back decades. At the center of the argument is a political vision often described as Greater Israel, the belief held by some political movements that Israel should maintain control over territories captured during the 1967 war, including the West Bank and other strategic areas. Supporters describe this as a security necessity. Critics argue it prevents the creation of a viable Palestinian state. And this disagreement has shaped Middle Eastern politics for generations. The question that has remained unresolved is simple. If there is no independent Palestinian state, then what future exists for the millions of Palestinians living under Israeli control? That question has never had an easy answer. Some argue the solution is one democratic state where everyone has equal rights and representation. Others argue for two separate states living alongside each other. But the current reality has created a third situation, a long-term conflict where millions of people live under different political and legal conditions, with no clear path forward. And history shows that systems built around permanent imbalance rarely remain stable forever. They either change or they require increasing amounts of force to maintain. This is where the larger geopolitical story begins, because America's relationship with Israel has not existed in isolation. For decades, U.S. policy in the Middle East has been shaped by a larger strategic calculation involving regional power, security interests, alliances, and conflicts with governments seen as hostile to American influence. The wars in Iraq, the collapse of governments across the region, and the ongoing confrontation with Iran all became connected to this broader struggle for influence. None of these events happened because of one single issue. They were the result of competing interests, security concerns, ideology, and decades of unresolved conflict. But the deeper question remains: what happens when a political arrangement survives for decades without reaching a final solution? Because unresolved conflicts do not disappear. They evolve. They create new generations of anger, resistance, and political movements. And that may be the biggest change happening right now. Not simply a change in governments, not simply a change in elections, but a change in the willingness of ordinary people to accept an issue that was once considered too controversial to challenge. And when that happens, even the strongest political alliances can begin to transform. Because the biggest political shifts rarely happen overnight. They happen when millions of small changes finally reach a point where the old system can no longer function the way it used to. And that appears to be what is happening now. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Israel was built on a level of political certainty that few other alliances enjoyed. American presidents from both parties continued strong diplomatic, military, and financial support. Congress regularly backed policies favorable to Israel, and questioning that relationship often carried a major political cost. But the environment today is different. The younger generation of voters did not grow up with the same political assumptions as previous generations. They came of age in a world where information moves instantly, where traditional narratives are challenged constantly, and where images from conflicts around the world appear directly on their phones. That changes the way people understand foreign policy. A war that once felt distant now feels immediate. A debate that once happened behind closed doors is now happening publicly, every day. And that has created pressure on governments that were used to controlling the conversation. But this shift is not only about public opinion, it is also about strategy. For years, many policymakers believed that the conflict could be managed without actually being solved. The idea was that negotiations could happen later, security concerns could be handled temporarily, and the political situation could remain frozen. But frozen conflicts rarely stay frozen. They build pressure. And eventually, the cost of maintaining the situation becomes greater than the cost of changing it. This is where the idea of a long-term solution becomes unavoidable, because there are only a few possible futures. One possibility is a negotiated agreement creating two states, with both Israelis and Palestinians having recognized political rights, security, and a functioning government. This has been the official goal of many international leaders for decades, but achieving it has become increasingly difficult because of disagreements over borders, settlements, security, and control of territory. The second possibility is a single state where everyone living between the river and the sea receives equal political rights. That would mean one government, one legal system, and equal citizenship for all communities. But this idea also faces enormous political challenges because both sides fear losing national identity and security. The third possibility is continuing the current situation, a system where the conflict remains unresolved, where military control continues, and where every few years another crisis erupts. But history suggests that this option becomes harder to sustain over time, because every generation inherits the unresolved problems of the previous one. And when people feel they have no political future, resistance often becomes inevitable. This is also why the conflict has influenced American foreign policy across the Middle East for decades. The region has been shaped by competition between major powers, energy interests, military alliances, and ideological struggles. Countries like Iran became central players because of their opposition to Israel and their broader challenge to American influence in the region. Meanwhile, American involvement expanded through wars, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and military partnerships. Each action created new consequences. Each intervention changed the balance of power. And over time, the Middle East became one of the most complicated geopolitical environments in the world. But there is another factor that cannot be ignored. The global image of the conflict has changed. In previous decades, governments could rely heavily on official statements in traditional media. Today, every major event is documented instantly. Videos spread globally within minutes. Civilian suffering is visible in a way that previous generations never experienced. That does not automatically answer every political question. Conflicts are complex. Security concerns are real. Historical trauma matters. But the visibility of suffering has changed the emotional and political impact worldwide. And that is why support structures that once seemed permanent are now being questioned. The biggest question facing policymakers is no longer simply about military strength. It is about legitimacy. How long can any political arrangement survive if large parts of the world view it as unfair? How long can a strategy continue if younger generations reject the assumptions behind it? And how long can a conflict remain unresolved before the pressure for change becomes impossible to ignore? These questions are not easy. There are no simple answers. But one thing is becoming clear. The old political landscape is disappearing. The alliances, assumptions, and narratives that shaped the Middle East for decades are entering a new era. And the next chapter will not be determined only by governments. It will be shaped by public opinion, changing generations, and the decisions made by leaders on all sides. Because history shows that political systems built on permanent conflict eventually face a choice. They either adapt or they collapse under the weight of the contradictions they were built around. And right now, the world is watching that choice unfold. For decades, many believed that this conflict could simply be managed, not solved, not transformed, just controlled. A cycle of negotiations, temporary agreements, military operations, and diplomatic statements would continue, and the world would move on to the next crisis. But the events of recent years have shown the limits of that approach. Because when a conflict lasts long enough, the consequences eventually become impossible to contain. The political cost grows, the humanitarian cost grows, and the gap between official explanations and what ordinary people see becomes harder to ignore. This is why the current moment feels different. It is not only about one war or one government. It is about a decades-old political structure being tested from multiple directions at the same time. Inside the United States, voters are becoming more divided. Across Europe and other regions, governments are facing growing public pressure. Within Jewish communities, Christian communities, and political movements worldwide, debates that were once mostly private are now happening openly. The old assumption that this issue could remain outside normal political debate is disappearing. And that matters because political systems depend not only on power, they depend on consent. A government can maintain a policy for years through institutions, alliances, and influence. But when public belief begins to shift, the foundation underneath that policy starts changing. History is full of examples where powerful systems looked permanent until the moment they were not. Empires, colonial structures, political alliances. They often survive because everyone assumes they will continue. Then one day, the conditions that protected them begin to disappear. And the same question now surrounds the future of this conflict. Is the existing arrangement sustainable? For supporters of Israel's current policies, the argument has often centered on security. They point to decades of wars, attacks, and regional hostility. They argue that military strength and territorial control are necessary for survival in a dangerous neighborhood. From this perspective, any withdrawal or major political change creates risks that cannot be ignored. But critics argue that security alone cannot explain everything. They argue that controlling another population indefinitely creates a different kind of instability, a cycle where each generation grows up surrounded by restrictions, anger, and unresolved grievances. And this is where the debate becomes much deeper than a single political argument. It becomes a question about what kind of future can actually last, because a society cannot permanently rely on emergency measures. A temporary security arrangement can last for years, but when temporary becomes permanent, the entire structure begins to change. A checkpoint becomes a daily reality. A military operation becomes a recurring event. A political disagreement becomes a generational identity, and over time, the conflict becomes harder to separate from everyday life. This is why the idea of a final political solution has remained at the center of international debate. Not because leaders have not tried, many have, but because every possible solution requires difficult compromises that neither side has been willing or able to fully accept. Borders, security, Jerusalem, settlements, the status of refugees. Every issue is connected to history, identity, and fear. and every proposed solution creates new questions. For years, the international community promoted the idea of two states, two nations, two governments, two peoples with recognized rights. But the reality on the ground has made that increasingly complicated. Expansion of settlements, changing demographics, deepening mistrust, repeated cycles of violence. All of these factors have made a once simple diplomatic slogan much harder to achieve. At the same time, the alternative idea of one shared state raises its own enormous challenges. Could two groups with decades of conflict build a single political system together? Could both sides trust the same institutions? Could national identities survive in a shared framework? These are not easy questions, but avoiding them does not make them disappear, and that may be the most important point. For years, the world has treated the conflict as something that can be postponed, a problem for another administration, another decade, another generation. But the current moment suggests that postponement has reached its limits. The pressure is no longer only coming from diplomats. It is coming from voters, from younger generations, from international institutions, from people watching events unfold in real time. And once public opinion begins moving, political leaders eventually have to respond. This does not mean the future is predictable. History rarely moves in a straight line. There can be unexpected alliances, new leaders, new negotiations, new crises. But the old assumption that nothing fundamental can change is becoming harder to defend. The world is entering a period where the questions that were avoided for decades are becoming unavoidable. What kind of political future is possible? What rights should people have? What security guarantees are necessary? And what happens when a conflict has lasted so long that the next generation refuses to inherit it? Those questions will define the future. Because the biggest turning points in history rarely begin with one dramatic moment. They begin when enough people realize the old system is no longer working. And right now, more people than ever are starting to ask whether the old approach can survive. And this is where the next phase of the story becomes even more complicated. Because when a long-standing political system begins to weaken, the question is not only what replaces it, the question is, what happens during the transition? History shows that moments of change are rarely calm. When old alliances start breaking apart, every group tries to protect its own interests. Governments adjust their strategies, political movements become more aggressive, public debates become more intense. And that is exactly the environment developing around this issue today. For years, the United States played a unique role in the region. It was not simply another country with an opinion, it was the central diplomatic and military partner. American support influenced international negotiations, security decisions, and the balance of power across the Middle East. That relationship gave Israel a level of strategic protection that few countries in the world have ever received. But influence comes with responsibility. And as public opinion changes, more people are questioning whether the same policies that once created stability are now contributing to instability. This is the dilemma facing Washington. Continue the same approach and risk growing isolation, or change direction and risk damaging a relationship that has shaped American foreign policy for generations. Neither option is simple. Because alliances built over decades are not easily rewritten. But neither are they immune from change. The reality is that global politics is moving into a different era. The world that existed after the Cold War is disappearing. Countries are becoming more willing to challenge American influence. New regional powers are emerging, and international institutions are facing pressure to respond differently than they did in the past. In that environment, conflicts that were once treated as permanent are being reevaluated. The Middle East is no exception. For decades, many leaders believed that military superiority could create enough stability to avoid a final political agreement. But military power can control territory. It cannot automatically create acceptance. It can prevent certain actions, but it cannot remove the underlying causes of conflict. That is the lesson many analysts have pointed to throughout history. A conflict based only on force tends to continue because every generation creates new reasons to resist. And this is why the debate has moved beyond traditional security arguments. It has become a debate about the future. What happens to millions of people who grow up without a clear political future? What happens when younger generations inherit a conflict they did not create, but are expected to continue? What happens when people around the world see the same images every day and form opinions based on those experiences? These are the questions shaping the next decade, because the information age has changed warfare itself. In the past, governments could control much of the narrative. Today, the battlefield and the media environment are connected. A single video can influence elections. A single image can change public opinion. A single event can create international pressure within hours. This means governments no longer operate in the same information environment they did decades ago. The ability to shape public perception has become much harder, and that has consequences. It means leaders can not only think about military outcomes, they must also think about legitimacy. They must consider how actions will be viewed not only by allies, but by populations around the world. Because legitimacy is one of the most powerful forces in international politics. A government can have weapons, it can have alliances, it can have economic power. But if enough people believe the system is unfair, pressure for change continues to build. This is why the current moment is so significant. The debate is no longer limited to diplomats and experts. It has entered everyday conversations, university campuses, social media, newsrooms, families, communities. People who rarely discussed foreign policy before are now engaging with one of the most complex political questions on Earth. And that creates another challenge for leaders. Once a debate becomes part of public consciousness, it becomes much harder to return to the old way of doing things. The question is no longer whether people are paying attention. They are. The question is what they will demand next. Will governments continue supporting the same strategies? Will new political movements emerge? Will negotiations return with a different framework? Or will the conflict continue until another major crisis forces change? No one can know the exact answer, but the pattern throughout history is clear. When a political arrangement depends on avoiding difficult questions, eventually those questions come back. And when they return, they are usually harder to solve than they were before. The future of this conflict will not be decided by one speech, one election, or one agreement. It will be shaped by millions of decisions made by leaders, citizens, and movements on every side. But one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The old assumptions are breaking. The idea that this conflict can remain frozen forever is being challenged. And whether the world is ready or not, a new chapter has already begun.